Throughout high school and early adulthood, I started immersing myself in classic literature. Early on, I concentrated on Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, with a couple Bronte books thrown in. But eventually I got distracted and realized I wanted to read more new books as well, especially in what has always been my favorite genre, fantasy. Since then, I hadn't touched many classics beyond those I already loved, such as Jane Eyre and the works of Jane Austen. I did a reread of Wuthering Heights a couple years ago, and liked it more the second time. But my passion for classic literature was reignited in December. Not wanting to start anything big, preferring to leave everything fresh for the new year, I shopped my own shelves and came across my Bronte collection. Having time to kill before the new year started, I thought, why not? Tackling books I'd left to sit for a few years, I started with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and fell in love. Immediately arrested by the story, the characters, and the message at the core of the story, I was particularly impressed with how edgy the book was for its time. Before long, I was burning through all of the Bronte books I had. And in researching the sisters, I decided to research other female authors of the time, discovering the histories of writers like Elizabeth Gaskell and Mary Elizabeth Braden. However, while I wanted to focus on female writers, including the greats like George Eliot and Virginia Woolf, I decided to dive into a handful of novels by male authors as well, particularly if they centered on a female protagonist. In going over the books I hope to read this year, I'll divide the first 5 sections by author, as I have several books, as much as 5 or more, from the same writers, while the last section will be a smattering of books from different authors. Before we dive in, I'm Riley and this is Otherworldly Fiction. On this channel, I rant about books and share the odd writing advice, so if any of that interests you, be sure to subscribe. Without further ado, here are the classics I'd like to read this year. Counted among the greats, and read as much as Jane Austen or the Bronte sisters, George Eliot was one of the best female writers of her time, if not one of the best writers, period. She wrote several novels, and having loved both Austen and all 3 of the Brontes, I felt I was overdue to dive into Eliot's work, especially as her use of a pen name revealed something of the time she lived in. As great as she was, she had to pretend to be a man to be seriously respected. Starting off, I purchased Middlemarch, which I've already completed. I loved it. The characters are deep and more richly explored than in any book I've ever read. But I didn't stop there. I also purchased The Mill on the Floss, Daniel Deronda, Silas Marner, and Scenes of Clerical Life, which represent the best of Eliot. I keep forgetting what each book is about, but every time I go back and check, I love the ideas all over again. So I have high expectations for the rest of her work. In researching female writers of the Victorian era, one name kept popping up: Elizabeth Gaskell. Forgotten when compared with Austen or Eliot, Elizabeth Gaskell has developed something of a cult following. Part of the resurgence of interest in her work comes down to BBC's adaptation of Cranford, but Gaskell penned several books which held up over the years. The book of hers which sounded most interesting to me was Wives and Daughters. As the name implies, the book closely follows the lives of intertwining families. Though there's a particular focus on the wives and daughters, the men within each family are covered too. And the book covers everything from family relationships to romance, making it right up my alley. After that, I purchased her other big works, including Cranford, which, like Middlemarch, focuses on a specific community and everything that happens within it. Other Gaskell books I bought were North and South, Mary Barton, and Ruth. Ruth is one I'm especially excited about, as it centers on a fallen woman in a time when women were judged much more harshly than men for the same actions. In regards to novels like North and South, Gaskell has also been compared to Dickens, as, like Dickens, she wasn't afraid to reveal the cracks in society, and through her work, prompt readers to consider the social justice issues of their time. Moving into the 1900s, another author I'd like to revisit is Virginia Woolf. I did read Mrs. Dalloway when I was a teenager, and while I remember liking it, I don't feel I fully understood it at the time. Having reread other classics and appreciated them the more with age, I want to give Virginia Woolf another chance. I plan to reread Mrs. Dalloway, and then I'd like to tackle Orlando, a book which has always sounded fascinating to me because of its premise in which the character's gender switches. This was written in the 1900s, making a story that explored issues of gender quite progressive for the time. But included in the set I got, there is also A Room of One's Own, To the Lighthouse, and The Voyage Out. Woolf's style can be a barrier, but if there's one thing I love in a story, it's richly developed characters. And Woolf's books are very character-oriented, something I appreciate in novels. I'm already falling in love with George Eliot, and Woolf took inspiration from Eliot, as Eliot also does deep character studies, so I think I'm really going to enjoy her work. As a quick aside, be sure to boop that like button if you're enjoying my rambling so far. I discovered my love of Daphne du Maurier back in October, when I read her best-loved novel, Rebecca. I always loved the Rebecca film, and I was happy to learn that Hitchcock, who didn't always respect the writers he adapted, including du Maurier herself, actually adapted the book faithfully. Rebecca quickly became one of my new favorite books, but I was struck by its similarities to another of my favorite books, Jane Eyre. And in doing further research, I learned that the Brontes were a particular influence for du Maurier. As such, I'm super excited to dive into the work of someone who loved the Brontes as much as I do. I plan to read at least 3 books of du Maurier's, those being The Birds and Other Stories, Jamaica Inn, and My Cousin Rachel. When it comes to the first 2 books, Hitchcock apparently screwed them up. I personally liked The Birds as a film, but from what I understand, the book and the film, aside from the conceit of aggressive birds, are essentially different stories. And the Jamaica Inn film was an especial disappointment for du Maurier. As for My Cousin Rachel, I'm super excited, as while I don't normally go for mysteries, the mystery at the center of this book intrigues me. Rachel, the widow of our hero's cousin, is a complicated figure, as there's suspicion around whether or not she killed her husband, given his fortune and the suddenness of his death. While Philip is suspicious of her, he's also charmed. Written in the same gothic vein as Rebecca, the character of Rachel herself sounds similar to that of Rebecca, in that she could be wicked on the inside, but outwardly charming. But I'll have to read the book to find out if she really is a villain, or exactly the charming woman she appears to be. As with du Maurier, I discovered a new favorite author in October, and that was Shirley Jackson. I've already read The Haunting of Hill House, and while I enjoyed it, I wasn't obsessed with it, though it certainly gave me a lot to think about, including the romantic implications between the 2 leading women, Theo and Eleanor. However, if there was one story that really stuck with me, that was The Lottery, which I read in high school for English class and never forgot. As for October, it was We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which cemented my love of the author. I've already talked at length about the book in my top 10 books of 2023 video, but I adored it. Mary Cat was such a complex character, and one of my favorite protagonists of all time, despite her role as an anti-hero. In continuing to explore Jackson's work, I plan to read The Lottery again, along with the other short stories included in its collection, as well as The Bird's Nest, which explores the unsettled mind of a young woman. I'm on a book buying ban now, but when that's lifted, I'd like to grab and read 2 other books from the author, Hangs a Man and The Sundial, which are supposed to be among her best work. If the mood strikes me, I might even reread The Haunting of Hill House, but I'm not making any promises, as I want to concentrate on reading books I haven't yet or haven't read for a long time. Now that I've covered the authors I plan to binge, I'll quickly go over the standalone novels I plan to read. All of these fall firmly under the Victorian literature category and are a mixture of male and female authors. Starting with some of the better-known works, I plan to read Thomas Hardy's Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I'm sorry if I butchered that name. Out of all the books, I'm especially excited for this one, as we follow a woman who, if I understand correctly, impersonates the member of an illustrious family so as to have a claim on the fortune. If that doesn't sound like an intriguing book, I don't know what does. Next, I plan to read Madame Bovary and Anna Karenina. Again, both books are written by male authors, Gustave Flaubert and Leo Tolstoy respectively, but are centered on female protagonists, showing how interesting female heroines could be as people and characters in a time when women were mostly overlooked. Not as well known, but with cult followings of their own, we have East Lynne, written by Mrs. Henry Wood, and Lady Audley's Secret, written by a Mary Elizabeth Braden. As with Gaskell, these authors and their books are making something of a comeback, as those interested in classic literature unearth those female authors in danger of being forgotten when compared with their male counterparts. Last but not least, I also need to read Charles Dickens' Bleak House. As a teen, I went through a Dickens phase, buying and reading every Dickens novel I could. But, owing to its impressive size, I never got around to this one. So, out of guilt, I feel it's time to finally give the book its due. Reading all this classic literature has put me back in the right headspace for it, and I feel bad that I've ignored it as long as I have. This list is subject to change. There are books I might not get to this year, as I also have a pile of fantasy novels I plan to read. Moreover, as I binge certain authors, I might add to the list as well, as Daphne du Maurier's The Loving Spirit sounds interesting to me, to say nothing of the other Virginia Woolf classics or Shirley Jackson books I might want to try. I can't guarantee I'll finish everything, and I don't plan to put any kind of pressure on myself to do so, especially since many of these books are chonkers. But at this time, these are the books I'm most excited to read. Mind you, this only covers the classic literature I plan to dive into, and doesn't represent the whole of my reading tastes. I also plan to read a number of fantasy novels, which I cover in the video on the left. And in 2023, I fell in love with books from a variety of genres, as seen on the video on the right. Thank you for watching, and happy reading!